The night Ava Hart wore the wrong dress, her husband finally looked at her and realized he'd been married to a stranger for 3 years. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. The appropriate gown was already hanging in the closet, perfectly suitable for a billionaire's wife attending Florence's Renaissance Gala. Safe, elegant, forgettable. But Ava didn't wear what was expected. She wore the short black silk dress from the night they met, the one that made her feel like a person instead of an accessory. When Ethan Vale emerged from his study at 7:45, his gaze swept past her toward the door, then snapped back with the force of recognition. For 3 seconds he simply stared. The phone slipped from his ear. His carefully controlled expression fractured into something close to panic, because the woman standing in his foyer in red heels and a dress that refused to apologize wasn't the symbol he'd been maintaining. She was Ava, the real one, and he'd almost forgotten she existed. By midnight, cameras would flash. A rival would ask for a waltz, and Ethan would finally understand what he'd been losing. The Florence morning light poured through the penthouse windows like liquid amber, catching dust motes that drifted between imported marble and untouched coffee cups. Ava stood in the walk-in closet, her fingertips grazing hangers of silk and cashmere, each piece selected by Ethan's assistant, each one perfectly appropriate for a billionaire's wife. The air smelled faintly of bergamot and leather, expensive and sterile. Like everything else in their life together, she pulled out the cream Valentino gown hanging front and center. Elegant, demure, forgettable. Exactly what was expected for tonight's Renaissance Gala, where Ethan Vale would make his keynote speech about sustainable luxury to Europe's wealthiest investors. Ava would stand beside him, smile at the right moments, and fade into the background of flash photography, a beautiful accessory to his empire. Her reflection in the gilt mirror showed a woman who'd mastered the art of disappearing while remaining visible. Ava had spent 3 years perfecting this version of herself, the supportive spouse who never asked for too much attention, who understood that Ethan's work came first, second, and third. She'd learned to measure her worth in his calendar gaps, the 15-minute breakfast meetings, the occasional Friday dinner between Dubai and Singapore. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the Tuscan sunlight or the weight of another anniversary forgotten last month. Maybe it was simply exhaustion from living like a guest in her own marriage. Ava's hand drifted past the approved gown to the back corner of the closet, where a garment bag hung untouched since their move from New York. Inside was the short black silk dress from 4 years ago, the night she'd worn red heels to a gallery opening, and Ethan Vale, then just another face in the crowd, had crossed the room to ask her name. The decision happened in the space between heartbeats. Ava unzipped the garment bag and pulled out the black dress, feeling the cool silk slip through her fingers like water. It was shorter than anything she'd worn in 3 years, cut to skim mid-thigh with a neckline that dipped just enough to suggest confidence rather than desperation. She could hear Elena, their housekeeper, moving through the living room, preparing for the evening's pre-gala cocktail hour. Ethan was already in his study on a video call with Tokyo, standard Tuesday afternoon. He wouldn't emerge until the car arrived at 7:45, and even then, he'd probably spend the ride reviewing talking points on his tablet. Ava slipped into the dress. The fit was perfect. Muscle memory from a version of herself who'd believed in spontaneity and late-night conversations. She applied her makeup differently, too. A bolder lip, less powder, eyes that demanded to be seen rather than simply present. Her stylist would have objected to the deviation from the Veil brand aesthetic, but her stylist wasn't invited to this particular rebellion. At 7:30, she descended the curved staircase in red heels that clicked against marble like a countdown. Elena looked up from arranging champagne flutes and froze, her expression cycling through surprise, concern, and something that might have been approval. "Mrs. Vale, the cream gown, change of plans," Ava said simply. The study door opened. Ethan emerged in his Tom Ford tuxedo, phone pressed to his ear, nodding at whatever Singapore was saying. His gaze swept past Ava toward the door, then snapped back with the force of recognition. For 3 full seconds, he simply stared. The phone slipped an inch from his ear. "I'll call you back," he said into the device, voice strange. Ava met his eyes across the foyer. "Is there a problem?" Ethan's jaw worked. "That dress. You don't like it?" He seemed to be searching for words in a language he'd forgotten. You wore that the night we met. I know. Something flickered across his face, confusion maybe, or the distant cousin of panic. The gala has a certain expectation. The press will what? Notice I'm here? Ava kept her voice level, pleasant even. That's the general idea of attending, isn't it? The grandfather clock in the hall struck 7:45. Their driver would be waiting downstairs. Ethan's hand flexed at his side, a rare tell of discomfort. He was a man who controlled boardrooms and billion-dollar mergers, but right now he looked like someone who'd just realized he'd been reading the wrong script. We should go, he said finally. Ava picked up her clutch, not the Hermes he'd given her last Christmas, but a vintage beaded number she'd bought herself years ago, after you. As they rode the elevator down, she caught him glancing at her reflection in the polished brass doors. Not the absent once-over of marital habit, but actual looking as though seeing something that had been there all along, but rendered invisible by assumption. The night was about to get interesting. The Renaissance Gala occupied the entire Palazzo Corsini, its Baroque halls transformed into a maze of champagne stations and strategic networking. Ava had attended dozens of these events, always as Ethan's +1, never as herself. The unspoken rules were clear. Smile for cameras, make small talk with investors' wives, deflect personal questions with grace, and above all, don't create complications for Vail Enterprises. Tonight felt like walking into a building she'd memorized in the dark, only to find someone had switched on all the lights. Camera flashes erupted as they stepped from the car. Ethan's hand found the small of her back, standard procedure, but his fingers pressed differently, like he wasn't sure where she ended and the dress began. A reporter called out, "Mr. Vail, who designed Mrs. Vail's dress?" Ethan opened his mouth, likely to redirect toward business matters, but Ava spoke first. "It's vintage, from a little shop in Brooklyn that closed 3 years ago." The reporter's eyebrows lifted. "You kept it all this time?" "Some things improve with age," Ava said, catching Ethan's sharp glance. Inside, the palazzo hummed with power and old money. Ethan was immediately absorbed by a cluster of German industrialists discussing carbon-neutral manufacturing. Ava knew her cue. Drift toward the designated wives' corner by the Caravaggio, discuss vacation homes and charity galas, become part of the elegant wallpaper. Instead, she accepted a champagne flute from a passing server and moved toward the balcony overlooking the Arno. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and river water, a small mercy of nature in a world of networking scripts. Quite the entrance. Ava turned to find a man in his early 40s, dark hair silvered at the temples, holding his own champagne with the casual confidence of someone who'd earned rather than inherited his place here. His smile was warm but not predatory. A rare commodity at these events. "Adrian Carter," he offered. "I run a sustainable architecture firm. We're boring everyone at the bar with talk of bamboo scaffolding. Ava Hart." She paused. "Vail. Ava Vail." His expression flickered with something that might have been understanding. The hyphen hesitation. "I know it well. My ex-wife kept her name, then added mine, then dropped mine, then briefly reconsidered. It was a whole journey." Ava found herself smiling, actually smiling, not the practiced curve she'd perfected for camera lenses. "How did you know I hesitated?" "Because you looked at your ring first." Adrian nodded toward her left hand. People who are sure of their names don't need to check their hardware. It was the kind of observation that should have felt invasive but instead landed like recognition. Ava glanced back through the glass doors at the crowd. Ethan stood in the center of the expanding circle, hands moving through the air as he made some point about vertical integration. He hadn't looked for her once. "Your husband's speech is in 20 minutes, Adrian said, following her gaze. "I have to admit, I'm curious what he'll say." "Vail Enterprises isn't known for public vulnerability." "No," Ava agreed quietly. "We're not." The speech began right on schedule. Ethan took the stage beneath a Renaissance fresco of Apollo, his presence commanding in the way that came from years of practice. Ava stood in her designated spot, second row, slightly right, positioned for the photographer's ideal angle of supportive spouse. 3 years ago, Ethan began, his voice carrying through the hall without microphone strain, I stood in a similar room and made promises about sustainable luxury. Tonight I'm here to show receipts. The crowd chuckled at the casual language from such a formal figure. Ethan clicked through slides showing carbon reduction metrics, supply chain innovations, worker satisfaction scores. It was a masterclass in corporate responsibility, presented with the precision of a man who measured success in quarterly reports. But then something unexpected happened. Mid-sentence, while discussing a partnership with Kenyan farmers, Ethan's gaze swept the audience and caught on something, or someone. His next words faltered for half a beat, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't know him. But Ava knew him. She followed his eye line and found Adrian Carter leaning against a column, glass still in hand, watching not the presentation but her. Ethan's recovery was smooth. He continued through his talking points about ethical sourcing and transparent accounting. But twice more his attention flickered toward the back of the room where Adrian stood, then back to Ava, with an expression she couldn't quite parse. When the speech ended to polite applause, Ethan descended from the stage, shaking hands as he moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency. He reached Ava within 60 seconds, unusually fast for a man who typically spent 30 minutes working a room. "We should," he began, but Adrian had already closed the distance. "Brilliant presentation," Adrian said, extending his hand. "Adrian Carter, Green Frame Architecture. I'd love to discuss collaboration on your Dubai project." Ethan's handshake was firm, professional, and lasted precisely 2 seconds longer than friendly. "The Dubai project is fully contracted." "Of course. Though I notice your Milan expansion could benefit from a sustainability consultant who actually lives in the culture, rather than just auditing it." Adrian's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "I've worked with 12 Fortune 500 companies on exactly that integration. My assistant handles new vendor inquiries." Naturally, Adrian turned to Ava. "Mrs. Vale, I was hoping to steal one dance before the orchestra takes their break, if your husband can spare you." The question hung in the gilded air. A simple request, socially appropriate, and yet somehow loaded with more weight than champagne and ballroom protocol should carry. Ava felt Ethan's attention lock onto her with the focus he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. "I don't dance," she said, which was a lie they both knew. She'd danced with Ethan exactly once, 4 years ago in a Brooklyn gallery while a jazz trio played and everything felt possible. "Shame," Adrian said. "The orchestra's doing Sinatra. Seems criminal to waste it on real estate conversations." Ethan's jaw tightened. "My wife prefers—" "A waltz would be nice," Ava heard herself say. The silence that followed lasted only a moment, but in it, Ava felt the architecture of her marriage shift like tectonic plates deciding whether to settle or crack. Ethan's expression cycled through surprise, calculation, and something that looked dangerously close to jealousy before landing on practiced courtesy. "Of course," he said. "Enjoy yourselves." Adrian offered his arm. Ava took it, feeling the expensive fabric of his jacket under her fingers, aware of every camera in the room suddenly interested in her movement. As they crossed to the dance floor, she glanced back once. Ethan stood exactly where she'd left him, surrounded by investors eager for his attention, his gaze following her with an intensity she hadn't felt in 3 years. If you've been wondering whether marriages can survive on scheduling alone, drop a comment and subscribe to Infinite Stories for tales of love relearned and truths reclaimed. The waltz was competent, nothing more. Adrian led with the ease of someone who'd taken lessons at some point, probably during a first marriage that ended in the kind of amicable divorce that left room for holiday cards. They moved through the basic box step while Sinatra's voice wrapped around the palazzo's vaulted ceiling. "You're very good at this," Adrian said. "At dancing, at pretending you don't notice your husband watching us like we're hostile merger negotiations." Ava allowed herself a glance toward the edge of the dance floor. Ethan stood with a German automotive executive, nodding at something being said, but his eyes tracked her movement with the precision of surveillance software. When their gazes met, something in his expression cracked, just for a moment, just enough to show the man underneath the CEO veneer. "He's protective of company assets," Ava said lightly. "Is that what you are?" Adrian's tone held no judgment, just curiosity. "An asset?" The question should have offended her. Instead, it landed like truth spoken in a language she'd been pretending not to understand. Before she could answer, The song transitioned into something slower, more intimate. Other couples drifted onto the floor, and suddenly they were surrounded by the kinds of people who appeared in Forbes profiles and charity auction catalogs. Mrs. Vale. A woman in emerald silk materialized beside them. Diane Rothschild, wife of Ethan's largest European investor. I didn't recognize you at first. That dress is quite daring. The word hung between compliment and criticism. Ava had known Diane for 2 years through a series of identical charity luncheons where they'd discussed nothing of consequence while eating salmon that tasted like politeness. Thank you, Ava said simply. It's just so different from your usual style. Robert was just saying to Ethan how you've always had such refined taste, never drawing unnecessary attention. Diane's smile was sharp as a credit card edge. But I suppose we all deserve to experiment occasionally. Adrian's hand tightened slightly at Ava's waist, a silent offer of support she hadn't realized she needed. I think Mrs. Vale's style has always been refined. The rest of us were just too busy looking at balance sheets to notice. Diane's expression flickered with something between surprise and recalibration. Before she could respond, Ethan appeared at Ava's shoulder with the sudden inevitability of a thunderstorm. Diane, Robert is looking for you, he said, his voice carrying the particular smoothness that meant he was 3 seconds from losing his temper. Something about the Monaco property timeline. Diane knew a dismissal when she heard one. She floated away in a cloud of expensive perfume and passive aggression. The music continued, but the dance floor suddenly felt very small. Thank you for the waltz, Adrian said to Ava, reading the room with the wisdom of a man who knew when to exit gracefully. Perhaps we'll meet again when the bamboo scaffolding conversation is more appropriate. He nodded to Ethan and disappeared into the crowd with the ease of smoke dissolving, which left Ava and Ethan standing together on a dance floor full of witnesses, neither quite sure what script they were supposed to be following. We should talk, Ethan said finally. Here? Ava gestured at the palazzo full of investors and journalists and people with camera phones. The terrace. 5 minutes. He didn't wait for confirmation, just turned and headed toward the glass doors with the assumption that she would follow. Ava counted to 30, long enough to make her point, short enough not to cause a scene, then made her way through the crowd. She caught fragments of conversation as she passed. Quarterly projections, yacht specifications, vacation homes in Belize. The same words cycling through the same mouths at the same volume, as predictable as elevator music. The terrace overlooked the Arno, its dark water reflecting lights from the Ponte Vecchio. Ethan stood at the railing, his profile sharp against the Florentine skyline. For a moment, he looked like the man she'd met 4 years ago, before the empire expanded, before the calendar became a weapon, before they'd traded conversations for scheduling efficiency. That dress, he said without turning. You mentioned that earlier. I remember buying you champagne that night. You ordered it in Italian and the bartender laughed because you'd accidentally asked for shoes instead of bubbles. Ethan's hands gripped the railing. You turned red, but you laughed too. That's what made me come over, the fact that you could laugh at yourself. Ava stepped closer, her heels clicking against stone. When did you stop looking at me like that? Like what? Like I was someone you wanted to know, not just someone who came with the marriage contract. The question landed between them like a chess piece declaring check. Ethan turned finally, and in the terrace lighting, she could see the exhaustion he usually hid beneath expensive tailoring and strategic confidence. I don't know, he said, and the honesty in his voice was more painful than any lie would have been. They didn't return to the gala immediately. Instead, they stood on that terrace like two people who'd just discovered they'd been reading different maps to the same destination. The music drifted through the glass doors, muffled by expensive architecture and 3 years of accumulated silence. I built Vale Enterprises for us, Ethan said finally. Every acquisition, every expansion. I thought I was creating security, a life where you'd never have to worry about anything, except being married to someone who's actually present. Ava kept her voice level. Not cruel, but not gentle either. You gave me a penthouse and a platinum card and a closet full of appropriate outfits. What you didn't give me was a reason to believe you remembered why you married me. Ethan flinched. It was subtle, a tightening around his eyes, a breath held too long. But Ava had spent 3 years learning to read the micro-expressions he showed no one else. That's not fair, isn't it? Ava pulled out her phone, opened her calendar. Look, May 15th, our anniversary. You were in Singapore closing the textile deal. June 3rd, my birthday. Dubai conference call that ran until midnight my time. August 22nd, the day my mother was hospitalized. You sent flowers from Tokyo. She looked up. I'm not angry you work, Ethan. I'm angry you stopped including me in your life while expecting me to remain a permanent fixture in mine. He reached for her hand, then stopped, as if suddenly uncertain whether he still had permission for casual touch. The hesitation said more than any speech could have. I can change, he said, can you? Or will you just schedule quality time and treat it like another boardroom obligation? Ava slipped her phone back into her clutch. I wore this dress tonight because I wanted to remember who I was before I became Mrs. Vale. Professional accessory. And you know what I realized? That woman wouldn't have tolerated 3 years of being invisible. A door opened behind them. Adrian Carter stepped out, stopped when he saw them, started to retreat. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Just needed air that doesn't smell like hedge fund anxiety. Stay, Ava said, surprising herself. We were just finishing. Ethan's jaw tightened. Ava, Mr. Carter, she continued, you mentioned collaboration earlier. What exactly did you have in mind? Adrian glanced between them, clearly aware he'd walked into relationship weather but too polite to flee. The Milan expansion. Vale Enterprises is building a luxury sustainable hotel. But from what I've seen, the community integration plan is, let's call it theoretical, meaning. Ethan's tone had shifted into boardroom mode. Defensive. Analytical, meaning you're building for Milan but not with Milan. The local artisans, the neighborhood businesses, the cultural preservation groups, they're not part of the conversation. You're importing sustainability rather than cultivating it. Adrian pulled out a business card, offered it to Ava instead of Ethan. My firm specializes in that bridge. We don't just audit compliance. We build genuine relationships. Ava took the card. It was simple, elegant, printed on recycled paper with a small tree watermark. Send me your portfolio. My email is on the Vale Enterprises website. You don't handle vendor relationships, Ethan said flatly. No, Ava agreed. But maybe I should start. I have 3 years of free time to fill after all. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Ethan stared at her as if seeing someone he didn't quite recognize, which Ava supposed was exactly the point. Adrian cleared his throat. I should return to the bamboo scaffolding conversation. Mrs. Vale. Mr. Vale, enjoy your evening. He disappeared back inside, leaving them alone with the Arno and a marriage that suddenly felt like it was standing on very uncertain ground. You're serious about this, Ethan said. The Milan project. Why shouldn't I be? I have an economics degree from Columbia and 5 years of nonprofit management experience I haven't used since becoming your wife. Maybe it's time I remembered I'm more than elegant wallpaper. Ethan moved closer, his hand finally making contact, fingers wrapping around her wrist, gentle but deliberate. I don't want to lose you. Then stop treating me like I'm already yours. Ava didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. Possession isn't the same as partnership, Ethan, and I'm done being something you own but don't actually see. They left the gala at midnight. The car ride back to the penthouse silent except for the sound of Florence traffic and Ethan's fingers drumming against his knee, an old tell of agitation he thought he'd trained out of himself years ago. Ava watched the city lights blur past her window, wondering when her marriage had become something that required this much translation. The penthouse was dark when they entered, just the ambient glow of city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows. Elena had left everything perfectly arranged. Champagne on ice they wouldn't drink, pillows arranged on the sofa in decorator-approved clusters, fresh flowers in the foyer that smelled like effort without intimacy. I have a call with Shanghai at 6, Ethan said, loosening his tie. Same sentence he'd been saying for 3 years. The universal signal that the evening was over and they could retreat to their separate corners of a shared life. Of course you do. Ava kicked off her red heels, feeling the cold marble against her feet. Don't let me keep you from running your empire. She started toward the bedroom, but Ethan's voice stopped her. The dress. Ava turned. What about it? The night we met, you spilled wine on it. Red wine, from that cheap Gallery Merlot they were serving in plastic cups. Ethan was staring at the silk as if it held some secret he'd forgotten. You laughed and said it was fine, that you'd had the dress for years and it was time for a change anyway. But I could tell you were upset. So I bought you another glass of wine and said we should spill it too. Make it symmetrical. The memory surfaced like something from someone else's life. You were wearing a gray suit. Not Tom Ford, something off the rack you'd bought for the gallery opening because you thought art openings required formal wear. Brooks Brothers, Ethan confirmed. First suit I'd ever owned. I was 28 and trying to network my way into venture capital. The gallery owner was someone's cousin who allegedly knew investors. He moved closer, hands in his pockets like a man afraid of what he might do if they were free. You were the only person there who wasn't checking phones every 30 seconds or talking about property values. You were actually looking at the paintings. They were terrible paintings, Ava said softly. Objectively awful, Ethan agreed. But you looked at them like they mattered, like giving something your full attention was the only polite thing to do. His expression shifted into something raw. When did I stop doing that with you? The question hung between them, honest and terrible. Ava felt the answer in her chest like a bruise she'd been pressing for 3 years, checking to see if it still hurt, confirming that yes, it did. I have something to show you, she said finally. She walked to the bedroom, Ethan following with the hesitance of a man approaching a door he wasn't sure he should open. From the back of her closet, past the designer gowns and appropriate ensembles, she pulled out a shoebox. Inside were the artifacts of a relationship that once existed. Ticket stubs from a jazz club, a napkin with Ethan's phone number written in coffee stains, a cheap postcard from Coney Island, and beneath it all, a small leather journal Ava opened to a page dated 3 years ago. Her handwriting filled the lines, careful and precise. I started keeping this 6 months after we got married, she said. Every time I wanted to tell you something, but you were too busy, I wrote it down. Thoughts, stories, questions, things I would have shared if we'd still been having conversations. Ethan took the journal with hands that weren't quite steady. He read silently, flipping pages that chronicled a marriage from the inside. Observations about the housekeeper's son starting college, questions about expanding into ethical fashion, memories of her mother's stories, fears about becoming the kind of person who measured worth in square footage. You never told me any of this. I tried. You had calls with Tokyo, meetings in Singapore, dinners with investors. Ava kept her voice even. After a while, I stopped trying. It felt like talking to someone who was physically present but emotionally checked out to another continent. Ethan closed the journal, his thumb tracing the worn leather. This is evidence. Of what? Of the fact that I've been failing you for 3 years while congratulating myself on providing security. He looked at her, with an expression that reminded her of that gallery opening. Vulnerability without performance. I don't know how to fix this, Ava. I built an empire by being strategic, controlled, always 3 moves ahead. But with you, I'm lost. It was the most honest thing he'd said in years. They sat on the bedroom floor. Not the bed with its 1,000 thread count sheets and designer duvet, but the actual floor, with the shoebox between them like a campfire around which 2 strangers might share stories. The clock on the nightstand glowed 1:47 a.m. Shanghai could wait. Ethan pulled out the Coney Island postcard. On the back, Ava had written in her younger handwriting, "Best bad hot dog I've ever eaten. Thank you for 20 minutes of not checking your phone." I remember this, he said quietly. Second month we were dating. You insisted we take the subway to Brooklyn because you wanted to prove you were low maintenance and fun. I threw up on the cyclone, Ava reminded him. You blamed the hot dog. I blamed the fact that you wrote it 3 times in a row to prove you weren't scared. Ethan's mouth curved into something that resembled the smile she remembered. Then we walked on the boardwalk for 2 hours and you told me about your plan to start a nonprofit helping immigrant women access business resources. You said it was ambitious, but unfocused. That I needed to narrow my target demographic and create measurable impact metrics. Ava pulled her knees to her chest. You were right, actually. I did need structure. But somewhere between accepting your advice and becoming your wife, I forgot I'd had ambitions at all. Ethan set down the postcard, picked up a napkin with faded coffee stains. This was from the Gray Dog. You ordered a latte with oat milk, and I teased you for being a walking Brooklyn cliché. You ordered black coffee and pretended to like it even. Though I could see you wince with every sip, I was trying to seem sophisticated. He laughed, actually laughed. The sound rusty from disuse. I was so focused on impressing you that I forgot to just be with you. Ava reached for the journal, flipped to an entry from 18 months ago. Listen to this. Today, Elena asked if I wanted to change the flowers in the foyer. I said yes without thinking. Later, I realized Ethan won't notice either way. Sometimes I wonder if I could redecorate the entire penthouse and he'd walk through it for a month before registering anything was different. Is this what marriage becomes? Beautiful indifference. The words landed like evidence in a trial she hadn't known they were having. Ethan's expression shifted through several emotions. Guilt, recognition, something that might have been grief for time they couldn't recover. I noticed tonight, he said finally. The dress. Not just the dress. The way you moved, like you'd stopped asking permission to take up space. The way you looked at Carter when he asked you to dance. Not flirtatious, just present. Like you were actually in the room instead of performing being in the room. Ethan's hand found hers on the floor between them, fingers interlacing with the careful hesitance of first touch. I've spent 3 years building an empire while my wife disappeared in plain sight, and I didn't notice until another man looked at you the way I used to. It was a confession wrapped in jealousy, wrapped in truth. Ava didn't pull her hand away, but she didn't squeeze back either. This wasn't forgiveness, not yet. This was just the first honest conversation they'd had since their wedding vows became scheduling logistics. Tomorrow, Ethan said slowly, I have meetings all day. Dubai, Singapore, and a conference call about the Tokyo expansion. I know. I'm going to cancel them. Ava looked up, searching his face for the catch. All of them? Not permanently, just rescheduled, pushed to next week. He was still holding her hand, his thumb tracing circles against her palm like a man learning Braille. I want to spend the day with you. No phones, no calls, no strategic networking. Just us in Florence, remembering how to be people who chose each other. It was a small gesture in the scheme of their problems. 1 day against 3 years of accumulated distance. But small gestures were how buildings got built. One brick, then another, until eventually something resembling shelter emerged. Okay, Ava said. Okay? Tomorrow. No phones. She squeezed his hand finally. But if you check your email even once, I'm going to the Uffizi alone and you can spend the day explaining to Singapore why their billionaire CEO suddenly developed boundaries. Ethan's smile was real this time, reaching his eyes in a way that made him look younger. Deal. They stayed on the floor until 3 in the morning, passing artifacts back and forth like archaeologists excavating their own history. The leather journal became a map of everything they'd stopped saying. Each entry a small proof that Ava had been there all along, waiting for someone to notice. When they finally climbed into bed, Ethan's arm wrapped around her waist, not with the absent routine of marital habit, but with deliberate intention. Ava felt the warmth of his chest against her back, the rhythm of his breathing evening out toward sleep, and wondered if marriages could be rebuilt on the foundation of one honest conversation. She'd find out tomorrow. The phone rang at 4:47 a.m., shattering their fragile truce with the ruthless efficiency of corporate emergency. Ethan's hand shot out, muscle memory overriding yesterday's promises, but Ava caught his wrist before he could reach the nightstand. You said no phones, she reminded him, her voice still thick with sleep. The ringing continued, insistent, urgent, the specific tone Ethan had assigned to his COO. He looked at Ava, then at the phone, his expression cycling through obligation and the very fresh memory of a promise made on their bedroom floor. It's Richard, he said. He doesn't call unless it's important. I know. Ava released his wrist. Answer it. The defeat in her voice was quiet but absolute. Ethan picked up the phone, already sitting up, already shifting back into CEO mode before the first word left his mouth. Richard, what's wrong? Ava couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she could read it in Ethan's face. The way his jaw tightened, the particular stillness that meant he was processing multiple scenarios simultaneously, the subtle shift in his breathing that indicated stress management protocols kicking in. How bad? Pause. Jesus, when? Another pause. No, don't issue a statement yet. I'll be there in 6 hours. Book me on the first flight out of Florence. He glanced at Ava, something apologetic flickering across his features. Yes, I know what today was supposed to be. This is bigger. He ended the call. Silence filled the bedroom like water in a sinking ship. Dubai, he said finally. The hotel project, structural issues, potential safety violations. If we don't get ahead of this, it's not just a PR disaster. It's potential criminal negligence charges. Of course. Ava sat up, pulling the sheet around herself like armor. Go save your empire. Ava, I'm not being sarcastic. I understand. People could get hurt if you don't handle this. She meant it, which somehow made it worse. I'm just tired of understanding. Ethan stood, already mentally packing, already running through the logistics of crisis management. But something in her tone stopped him. Come with me. To Dubai? Why not? We'll handle the emergency, then stay the weekend. The Burj, that restaurant you mentioned once that rotates. He was offering solutions like they were band-aids for structural damage. Make it up to you. Ava looked at him, really looked, and saw a man who genuinely believed that geographical change could substitute for emotional presence. I don't want rotating restaurants, Ethan. I want a husband who doesn't need international crises to remember we're supposed to be building something together. That's not fair. This is my company, my responsibility, and I'm your wife. When does that become your responsibility too? She stood wrapping herself in a robe. Go to Dubai, fix your hotel. But when you come back, we need to have a real conversation about whether this marriage is something you want to work on or just something you want to maintain for appearances' sake. The words hung between them like a prenup neither had signed, but both were, suddenly reading carefully. Ethan's phone buzzed with incoming messages. Richard sending flight details probably, or the legal team requesting emergency briefing calls. I'll come back, Ethan said. 3 days maximum. And when I do, we'll figure this out. Will we? Or will you come back for 48 hours before the next emergency in Singapore, or the crisis in Tokyo? Ava moved to the window, watching Florence wake up beneath a sky that promised rain. I need you to prove that I'm not just another item on your crisis management list. That when you say you'll be present, you mean it in hours and days, not just in eventually. Ethan moved behind her, his hands hovering near her shoulders before settling with careful uncertainty. What do you want me to do? Walk away from 200 construction workers whose safety is my responsibility? No. I want you to acknowledge that I'm asking you to choose, and that the choice is hard, and that you're going to choose the company because that's who you are. Her reflection in the window looked tired. I just want you to stop pretending that's not what's happening. The accuracy of the statement landed between them like evidence in a deposition. Ethan's hands fell away. He went to the closet, started pulling out luggage. His movements efficient and practiced, a man who'd perfected the art of packing for emergencies. When I come back, he said, folding a shirt with hotel precision, I want you to be here. Where else would I go? I don't know. Back to New York, your mother's house, Carter's sustainable architecture firm. The jealousy in his voice was new, or maybe just newly visible. Ava turned from the window. This isn't about Adrian Carter. This is about the fact that a stranger paid more attention to me in one evening than my husband has in 3 years. Ethan zipped the suitcase closed with more force than necessary. I know. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're about to get on a plane and prove my point. She crossed her arms. I'll be here when you get back. But I won't be here forever. There's a difference. He left 40 minutes later, kissing her forehead with the distraction of a man already mentally boarding his flight. The penthouse fell silent except for the sound of Florence. Traffic and Ava's own breathing, evidence of a marriage that existed on paper, and in public photographs but was slowly suffocating, in the space between promises and presence. She picked up Ethan's business card holder from the dresser where he'd left it. Beneath his cards was something she hadn't expected. A small photograph worn at the edges. Her and Ethan at Coney Island, both of them sunburned and laughing, her hair wild from the ocean wind. On the back in Ethan's handwriting, the day I knew. It was proof that he'd remembered even as he'd forgotten. Evidence that love existed, even as it was starving for attention. Ava slipped the photograph back where she'd found it and went to make coffee that she'd drink alone. 3 days became 5, then 7. Ethan called daily. Brief check-ins between legal consultations and safety inspections, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a man trying to manage a crisis across multiple time zones. Each conversation followed the same script. Apologies for the delay, promises he'd be home soon, updates about structural engineers and Dubai building codes that Ava listened to with the patience of someone waiting for a bus that might never arrive. On day 8, she stopped waiting. The Uffizi Gallery was quieter on weekday mornings. tourists thinning out after the initial rush. Ava stood in front of Botticelli's Birth of Venus, studying the way the goddess emerged from her shell with the kind of serene confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was. No apologizing, no shrinking, no performing for an audience that wasn't really watching. Magnificent, isn't it? Adrian Carter appeared beside her, holding a museum guide and wearing the slightly rumpled look of someone who'd been genuinely absorbed in art rather than networking. The way she just stands there, unapologetic about taking up space. "I didn't know you were still in Florence," Ava said. "Extended my trip. Turned out the bamboo scaffolding conversation was more productive than expected." He glanced at her. "Your husband returned from Dubai yet?" "Still there. Structural crisis became legal crisis became PR crisis. You know how it goes." Adrian nodded slowly. "I do, actually. My ex-wife used to say I was married to my firm first and her second. Took me 5 years and a divorce to realize she was right." He turned back to the painting. "The difference between love and possession is attention. Everything else is just expensive furniture." The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Ava found herself wondering when her marriage had become a beautiful penthouse she lived in alone, high ceilings and imported marble and no one to share coffee with in the morning. "I shouldn't complain," she said. "He's trying to prevent people from getting hurt." "That's not exactly abandonment." "No," Adrian agreed, "but it's also not partnership. There's a difference between being necessary and being chosen." He pulled out his phone, showed her a photo of a building mid-construction. "This is the Milan project I mentioned. We broke ground last week. Local artisans, neighborhood businesses. Actual integration instead of imposed luxury." "Your husband's model is efficient?" "But efficiency without community just builds beautiful isolation." Ava studied the photo, scaffolding, and steel beams and workers, who looked like they actually belonged there rather than being imported as labor. "You're not just selling your services, are you? You're making a point." "Little bit of both," Adrian admitted. "But mostly I'm offering you a reason to use that Columbia economics degree you mentioned. We could use someone who understands both luxury markets and social impact. The position would be real work, not trophy wife consulting." He handed her another business card, this one with a phone number written on the back. "Think about it. No pressure, no expectations. Just an offer from someone who thinks you're more interesting than your husband seems to realize." Left her there with Botticelli and a business card and the uncomfortable recognition that a relative stranger saw her more clearly than the man she'd married. That evening, Ava's phone buzzed with an incoming message. Not from Ethan, from Diane Rothschild of all people. The text was brief, efficient, and devastating. "Saw your husband at dinner last night. City Walk, Dubai. He wasn't alone. Woman in red dress, very attentive. Thought you should know. Some things are better addressed before they become public." Detached was a photo, grainy, taken from across a restaurant but clear enough to show Ethan at a corner table with a woman Ava didn't recognize. Dark hair, elegant posture, leaning in close while Ethan gestured through some explanation. It could have been innocent, a colleague, a legal consultant, a PR strategist. The kind of working dinner that happened constantly in his world. But it was 11 p.m. Dubai time in the photo. And Ethan's hand rested on the table between them, fingers almost touching the woman's wine glass in the space where casual became something else. Ava's hands shook as she called him. 3 rings, 4, then voicemail. She tried again. Same result. A text message appeared instead, in a meeting. "Call you in an hour." An hour came and went, then 2. At midnight Florence time, Ava stopped checking her phone. She pulled out the leather journal instead, opened to a fresh page and wrote, Day 8. Evidence. Photograph from Diane Rothschild showing Ethan at dinner. 11 p.m. Dubai, with unidentified woman. Context unclear. Intent unclear. What's clear? He didn't answer when I called. He said he'd be back in 3 days. It's been 8. At some point, delay becomes choice. At some point, absence becomes answer. She closed the journal and placed it back in the shoebox with all the other artifacts of a marriage that was either ending or had ended years ago, without anyone bothering to file the paperwork. The phone finally rang at 1:30 a.m. Ava let it go to voicemail. When she played the message back, Ethan's voice sounded tired and defensive in equal measure. Ava, I saw you called. I'm sorry. The legal team needed immediate consultation about liability structures. That photo Diane sent you is exactly what it looks like. A working dinner with the PR director. Her name is Samira Hassan. She's handling media strategy, and yes, it went late because crisis management doesn't follow convenient timelines. I know how this looks. I know I promised 3 days and it's been 8. I know I'm failing at this, but I'm not betraying you. I'm just trying to hold everything together and doing a terrible job of it. I'll be home tomorrow. I promise. We'll talk. Really talk. Please be there. The message ended. Ava sat in the dark penthouse holding the phone, wondering when I promise had become white noise instead of commitment. Tomorrow would make day 9. 9 days since Ethan had chosen crisis over conversation. Dubai over their fragile attempt at rebuilding. She looked at Adrian's business card on the nightstand. Legitimate opportunity or escape hatch, did it matter which? Either way, it was proof that life existed outside the beautiful prison of being Mrs. Vale, professional accessory to someone else's empire. Ava picked up the card, ran her thumb over the embossed letters, and made a decision that felt like either courage or surrender. Sometimes they looked exactly the same. Ethan returned on day 10, walking into the penthouse at 4 p.m. with luggage under his eyes and apologies already forming on his lips. Ava was sitting at the dining table, not working, not reading, just sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and a manila envelope that held either their future or the documentation of its ending. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "The delays, the dinner photo, all of it. I know how it looked. Sit down." Something in her tone stopped his momentum. Ethan set down his luggage and sat across from her at the table where they'd shared exactly 4 meals in 3 years, all of them with other people present. Ava pushed the envelope toward him. "Open it. What is this?" "Evidence." His hands hesitated, then pulled out the contents. Printouts of their shared calendar spanning 3 years, highlighted in different colors. Yellow for canceled plans, pink for last-minute business trips, blue for events he'd attended alone after promising they'd go together, green for the 4 times he'd actually kept a personal commitment. The pages painted a pattern so clear it required no explanation. Ethan flipped through them, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something that looked like seeing himself in a mirror for the first time. "I kept track," Ava said quietly, not out of spite, out of necessity, because every time you promised things would change, I wanted to believe you. But belief without evidence is just hope performing as marriage. Beneath the calendar pages was a bank statement, not theirs, but a charity account Ava had opened 6 months into their marriage. Regular deposits every month, carefully documented. "I started donating your apology money," she explained. "Every time you missed something and sent flowers or jewelry or another Hermes bag I didn't ask for, I calculated its value and gave it to organizations supporting women leaving difficult situations." It seemed poetic, turning guilt into something useful. Ethan stared at the statement showing thousands of dollars redirected into purpose. "You never told me. I told you lots of things. You just weren't listening." Ava pulled out another document, phone records. "These are my calls to you over the past year. Look at the pattern. I stopped calling after 6 p.m. your time because you never answered. I stopped calling on weekends because you were always in meetings. I stopped calling at all about 3 months ago because the voicemails I left went unreturned for days. The evidence mounted like witness testimony, in a trial where both parties knew the verdict but needed to hear it spoken aloud." Ethan's hands moved through the papers with increasing slowness. Each page another small proof of how thoroughly he'd been absent while believing himself present enough. "The dinner photo," Ava continued, "wasn't what broke us. It was just the moment I stopped pretending the pattern wasn't there. Diane Rothschild saw you with another woman and thought it was an affair. I saw you with another woman and thought, of course he's having late dinners in Dubai. Of course he's building relationships with people who aren't me. That's what he does, invests attention in everything except his marriage. Samira Hassan is a colleague. I believe you. That's not the point." Ava's voice remained steady, not angry, but absolutely clear. "The point is that a stranger across a restaurant had more reason to think you were having an affair than I did to think you were being faithful. Because faithfulness isn't just sexual exclusivity, Ethan. It's showing up. It's answering calls. It's remembering that you promised 3 days and delivered 10. It's caring enough to notice when your wife stops trying to reach you. Ethan set down the papers, his hands flat on the table like a man steadying himself against vertigo. What do you want me to do? I want you to tell me the truth. Not the version where you're trying and circumstances are hard and empires require sacrifice. The real truth. Ava leaned forward. Do you want to be married to me? Not married in the legal sense or the social sense or the good for business sense. Married in the sense where we're actually building a life together instead of running parallel tracks that occasionally intersect at charity. Callis, the question hung between them like a contract waiting for signature. Ethan looked at her. Really looked the way he had 4 years ago in a gallery when she'd been someone he wanted to know rather than someone he owned. Yes, he said finally. But I don't know how to be the person you need while also being the person everyone else needs. Then maybe you need to make a choice. Ava pulled out the final document. Adrian Carter's business card with a contract offer attached. I've been offered a position with Green Frame Architecture. Real work, real salary, real purpose. Based in Milan, starting next month. It's everything I used to want before I became the person whose job was wanting nothing. Ethan's face went carefully neutral. You're leaving. I'm considering it. Because staying in a marriage where I'm invisible feels like suffocating very slowly, while everyone compliments the beautiful room I'm dying in. She paused. But I'm giving you a choice first. The kind of choice you've been making without me for 3 years. The choice about what kind of life you actually want. I want you. Wanting isn't enough. Attention is proof. Presence is proof. Choosing me over the next crisis is proof. Ava stood, moved to the window overlooking Florence, the city that had witnessed her trying to remember who she was. You said you'd be back in 3 days. It took 10. That's a fact, not an accusation. Now I need you to prove that if I stay, the next time will be different. Not with promises, but with choices. Not with eventually, but with now. Ethan remained at the table, surrounded by evidence of his failure to show up. How do I prove that? That's the point. You can't prove it by saying it. You have to do it consistently over time until trust rebuilds from pattern rather than promise. Ava turned to face him. And if you can't do that, if the empire matters more than the marriage, then we need to be honest about what we're actually maintaining here. The silence that followed was heavy, with the weight of a relationship standing at its own crossroads, both parties finally looking at the same map and seeing different destinations. 24 hours later, Ava was scheduled to speak at an art exhibition opening. A small event she'd agreed to months ago, long before everything had fractured into evidence and ultimatums. The Palazzo Strozzi was hosting Visible Presence, women reclaiming space in Renaissance art, and Ava had been asked to say a few words about modern patronage and female autonomy. She hadn't expected Ethan to show up, but there he was, standing in the back of the gallery as she took the small stage, his presence causing the subtle ripple of recognition that followed billionaire CEOs into rooms they weren't expected to attend. Cameras clicked. Whispers spread. Diane Rothschild, predictably present, watched with the avid interest of someone who'd spent years collecting social ammunition. Ava gripped the podium, her prepared remarks suddenly feeling insufficient for the moment. She looked at Ethan, then at the painting behind her, Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith-slaying Holofernes, a woman taking up space with violent clarity. I was going to talk about patronage, Ava began, her voice carrying through the vaulted space, about how we fund art, how we choose what deserves to be seen, how visibility is a form of power. But standing here, I realize I'm more interested in a different question. What does it mean to be present? Ethan's expression shifted, recognition perhaps of where this was going. Renaissance women were often painted as allegories. Virtue, charity, justice. Abstractions rather than individuals. Beautiful symbols of ideals, not people with agency or voice. Ava gestured at the Gentileschi. Except when women painted themselves. Then they became subjects, not objects. People, not symbols. She could feel the room's attention sharpening. This was supposed to be safe rhetoric about art history and social progress, not whatever she was building toward. For 3 years, I've been a symbol. The wife of Ethan Vale, CEO of Vale Enterprises, appropriate, elegant, present at every necessary event. A beautiful allegory of support. She looked directly at Ethan. But symbols don't have coffee preferences or Columbia degrees or the capacity to be lonely. Symbols don't keep journals of things they wanted to say but never bothered because no one was listening. Symbols don't need attention. They just need good lighting. Diane Rothschild's phone was out, undoubtedly recording this unexpected public reckoning. Other guests exchanged glances, uncertain whether this was performance art or marital crisis. The question I've been asking myself, Ava continued, is whether marriages can survive on the same principle as Renaissance patronage, one party funding while the other creates, neither truly seeing each other as more than their function in the arrangement. She paused, and the answer I've come to is no, because love without attention is just maintenance, and I'm tired of being well-maintained. Ethan moved then, walking through the crowd with the determination of a man who'd finally realized what he was about to lose. He reached the front as Ava stepped away from the podium, their confrontation suddenly very public and very real. "You're right," he said, loud enough for the gallery to hear. "About all of it. The symbols, the maintenance, the 3 years of me choosing empire over marriage while calling it provision." The room held its collective breath. This was not how billionaire CEOs behaved at art openings, with vulnerability and public confession. "I built Vale Enterprises believing that success would prove I was worth loving," Ethan continued, his voice steady but raw. "That if I could create security and luxury and status, then being my wife would be enough compensation for my absence. I was wrong. I was so focused on building an empire that I forgot I was supposed to be building a life with someone I actually loved." Ava stood very still, aware of every camera pointed their direction, every guest leaning in to hear what came next. "The Dubai crisis," Ethan said, "could have been handled by Richard and the legal team. It didn't require me to be there for 10 days. I chose to go because crisis management is what I'm good at. It's where I feel competent and necessary and clear about my purpose. Being a husband, I'm terrible at it. I don't know how to measure success in conversations and coffee dates and showing up when there's no emergency to solve." He pulled something from his pocket, not a ring, not jewelry, but the photograph from Coney Island that he'd kept in his business card holder. He held it up so the room could see. "This is who I was when Ava agreed to marry me. Someone who rode the cyclone 3 times just to make her laugh. Someone who thought hot dogs and boardwalk walks were more valuable than networking events. Someone who paid attention." He looked at her. "I want to be that person again. Not the 28-year-old version, but the person who understands that presence is proof of love. And I'm willing to prove it, not with promises, but with choices. Starting now." Ava felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first crack of possibility. "What does that look like?" "Starting now? It looks like me canceling tomorrow's Singapore trip, rescheduling the Tokyo expansion meetings, hiring a COO who can handle the daily crisis management so I can handle actually being married to you." Ethan's hands found hers. "It looks like therapy, for both of us together learning how to be partners instead of parallel tracks. It looks like me understanding that if I lose Vale Enterprises but keep you, I'll be fine. But if I keep the empire and lose you, I'll have spent my life building a beautiful monument to what I wasn't willing to choose when it mattered." The gallery was silent except for the soft click of Diane Rothschild's phone recording what would undoubtedly become social media content within the hour. But for once, Ava didn't care about the audience or the cameras or what strangers would think of this very public unraveling and potential rebuilding. "You hurt me," she said quietly. "For 3 years you hurt me by being absent while calling it success. I need you to understand that rebuilding trust takes more than one grand gesture at an art opening. I know. I need you to understand that I've accepted the Milan position. Not as an escape, but as a choice to be someone beyond Mrs. Vale. If you want to rebuild this marriage, it's going to be with a wife who has her own work and purpose and identity separate from yours." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'm not asking you to be a symbol anymore. I'm asking if you'll let me learn to be your partner instead of your patron." It was the right answer. Not perfect, not a guarantee, but honest enough to be a foundation for something new. Ava felt tears she'd been holding back for 3 years finally surface. Not from sadness, but from the exhausting relief of being seen. "Okay," she said, "but you start proving it tomorrow. Every day, in small choices and boring moments, and when there's no audience to witness your commitment, that's when it counts. Tomorrow and every day after," Ethan agreed. They stood in the middle of the gallery, surrounded by Renaissance women reclaiming space, while real life reclaimed them from the performance of marriage they'd been maintaining. It wasn't an ending or a beginning, just an honest moment in the middle of two people deciding to try again, this time with eyes open and evidence replacing promises. 6 months later, Ava stood in the Milan green frame office reviewing architectural plans with Adrian Carter and a team of local artisans. The space smelled like coffee and timber samples, energizing in its purposeful chaos. Her phone buzzed, Ethan texting a photo of their Florence penthouse dining table set for two with a simple message, "Made dinner." Real cooking, not Elena's catering. Home by 7. She smiled and texted back, "Flight lands at 6:30. I'll be there." The marriage hadn't magically healed. Healing wasn't magic, it was work. Weekly therapy sessions where they practiced actually listening instead of performing understanding. Scheduled Friday dinners where phones were banned and conversations happened without crisis management urgency. Ethan hiring Marcus Chen as Vale Enterprises' new COO, a capable executive who could handle Dubai emergencies, while Ethan learned to handle being present for his wife. There had been setbacks. A Tokyo trip that stretched 2 days longer than promised, triggering old anxieties and requiring new conversations. Ava's Milan work demanding weekend travel that conflicted with their tentative rebuilding schedule. Moments where they both reverted to old patterns, Ethan retreating into executive efficiency, Ava withdrawing into journal entries instead of spoken words. But there were also mornings where Ethan made coffee the way she liked it and sat at the table long enough to actually drink it with her. Evenings where they walked through Florence with no agenda beyond being together. A Thursday when Ava called from Milan with a work frustration, and Ethan listened for 40 minutes without trying to fix anything. Just being present while she processed. Evidence accumulated differently now, not of absence, but of choice. Not promises about the future, but presence in the present. Adrian appeared at Ava's desk holding blueprints. The local stone suppliers confirmed, "We can integrate traditional Milanese craftsmanship into the modern structure without compromising either integrity or authenticity. Your husband's financing model actually works when you add genuine community partnership." "He'll be pleased to hear it," Ava said. "We're having dinner tonight. You should join us." "Third wheel to marital reconstruction?" "I'll pass," Adrian grinned. "But send him my regards. And tell him I still think he's mediocre at sustainable development, but apparently excellent at learning to be less. Terrible at marriage." Ava laughed, the easy laughter of someone who'd reclaimed the space to be herself. "I'll phrase it more diplomatically." That evening she walked into the Florence penthouse to find Ethan in the kitchen, actually cooking, not expertly, but earnestly. Pasta water boiled over slightly. Garlic bread was possibly too toasted. The salad looked store-bought. It was imperfect and domestic and exactly what rebuilding looked like. "You're early," he said, kissing her hello with flour on his hands. Traffic was light. Ava set down her bag, noticing the small changes that had accumulated. Fresh flowers she'd picked out herself. Books she was actually reading on the coffee table. Photos from Coney Island now displayed alongside Vale Enterprises press shots. "This smells ambitious. Aglio e olio." The recipe claimed it was simple. But I'm learning that simple in Italian cooking means deceptively technical. He stirred the pasta with concentration that reminded her of him reviewing acquisition contracts. "How was Milan?" "Productive. We broke ground on the community center. Adrian says your financing model works when we stop treating locals like vendors and start treating them like partners." She leaned against the counter. "He also said you're mediocre at sustainable development but improving at marriage." Ethan smiled, genuine, reaching his eyes. "I'll take that as a glowing review from a man who wanted to hire you away from me. He did hire me. Just not away from you, alongside you." Ava tasted the sauce he offered. "Need salt?" Noted. Professional opinion or personal preference? "Both." They ate dinner at the table, talking about Milan and Florence and the small architecture of daily life that marriage was actually built from. No crisis interrupted. No phones buzzed with emergency calls. Just two people choosing to be present with each other in the boring, essential way that proved everything grand gestures couldn't. After dinner, they stood on the terrace where they'd first tried to have this conversation months ago. The Arno reflected city lights, constant and changing like everything worth keeping. "I have something for you," Ethan said, pulling out a small box. Ava's expression flickered with old wariness. If this is expensive jewelry as apology for something, it's not. He opened the box. Inside was a simple bronze key to the Coney Island apartment. We don't have a Coney Island apartment, we do now. Small one-bedroom walking distance from the boardwalk. I bought it last month. Thought we could use a place that's just ours. No assistants, no staff, no empire maintenance required. Somewhere we can be terrible at cooking and good at being together. He held out the key. No pressure, no strings. Just a choice to build something small and real alongside everything else. Ava took the key, feeling its weight like a promise made of metal instead of words. You're serious, I'm learning to be. Slowly, imperfectly, but consistently. Ethan's hand found hers. I know 6 months doesn't erase 3 years. I know trust rebuilds slowly. But I'm here, Ava, not eventually, now. And I plan to keep proving that every boring, beautiful day we have. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was better, a real beginning. Built on evidence instead of assumptions. Presence instead of promises. 2 people choosing each other in the unsexy, essential work of actual partnership. Okay, Ava said, squeezing his hand. But when we're at Coney Island, you're riding the cyclone. 3 times like you used to. Deal. But you're eating the bad hot dogs. Obviously. They stood together on the terrace, holding hands like it was both new and familiar, looking at Florence and forward and at each other with the clear eyes of people who'd almost lost what mattered and chose to rebuild it brick by patient. Brick. The moral isn't that love conquers all, it's that love requires showing up, paying attention, and choosing partnership over possession every single day. What would you have done if your marriage became beautiful indifference? Drop a comment and subscribe to Infinite Stories for tales where proof is measured in presence, not promises.